बीते वर्षों में भ्रष्टाचार मुक्त इकोसिस्टम बनाने की दिशा में बेनामी संपत्ति अधिनियम को नोटिफाई किया गया है। आर्थिक अपराध कर फरार हुए अपराधियों की संपत्ति जब्त करने के लिए फजिटिव इकोनॉमिक ऑफेंडर्स एक्ट पारित किया गया है। सरकारी कामों में पक्षपात और भ्रष्टाचार के चलन को भी खत्म करने के लिए प्रभावी सिस्टम बनाया गया है।
Accident which has taken place on the Sarjapur road. It was an intentional accident which was caused by the bikers as well, because if you look at Ventat footage which was recorded on the dash camera, it is clearly being seen that this particular couple who were travelling on the Sarjapur road towards Chiknayak Nali were in the right lane, but then these two bikers who have already been identified as Dhanush and Rakshit come in from the wrong direction and crash into the vehicle intentionally on purpose, trying to extort money.
Mr. Fai, you are doing this for Pakistan. Mr. Fai, are you doing it on behalf of Pakistan, on behest of Pakistan? Mr. Fai, are you doing it for Pakistan?
And in other international news, after arriving in Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken sought that Israel maintain peace with Palestine. He further urged both the countries to ease tensions following a spike in violence that have left several killed on both the sides. Some 200 people had to be evacuated from a migrant camp near Spain's farming heartland after fire crews battled flames that engulfed the buildings. Meanwhile, it was unclear how the fire started. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen visited Ukraine and met with President Volodymyr Zelensky, while the Ukrainian president thanked Denmark for its steadfast support of Ukraine since the beginning of the Russian invasion. To visit the nation's Armed Forces Operations Command denied to comment on an ongoing debate over a possible delivery of fighter jets to Ukraine. Finland has once more expressed its wish to join NATO alongside Sweden. Speaking at a press conference in Helsinki, Foreign Minister of Finland said it was important that Finland and Sweden join NATO at the same time. Russia has refuted claims made by UK former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, while saying that he had lied in a recently released documentary where he had described a phone call with Vladimir Putin. At least 32 people have lost their lives, 147 have been injured as a suicide attacker blew himself up at a mosque in the capital of Pakistan's restive province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The Pakistani Taliban have claimed responsibility for the suicide bomb attack at a mosque in northwestern Peshawar that left at least 61 dead and more than 150 injured, mostly policemen. Days after the video of the deadly beating of Tyre Nichols by officers in Memphis was released, massive protests broke out across the United States. Federal and state authorities are investigating a crash involving a small bus and box truck in snowy conditions that have killed at least 6 in upstate New York near the Canadian border.
Top global updates. Denmark's Prime Minister visited Ukraine and met President Zelensky, while Ukrainian President thanked Denmark for its steadfast support since the beginning of the Russian invasion. However, reiterated his stance that weapons deliveries must be expedited. President Emmanuel Macron said Ukraine has not yet put in a formal request for fighter jets before France. Earlier, France had sent Ukraine air defense systems rocket launcher units, but has stopped short of sending battle tanks. United Nations confirmed that fighting and hostilities over the weekend in Ukraine killed and injured civilians, while critical facilities, including several hospitals, were damaged on both sides of the front line.
Accident which has taken place on the Sarjapur road. It was an intentional accident which was caused by the bikers as well, because if you look at Ventat footage which was recorded on the dash camera, it is clearly being seen that this particular couple who were traveling on the Sarjapur road towards Chiknayak-Nalli were in the right lane, but then these two bikers who have already been identified as Dhanush and Rakshit come in from the wrong direction and crash into the vehicle intentionally on purpose, trying to extort money.
Mr. Fai, you are doing this for Pakistan. Mr. Fai, are you doing it on behalf of Pakistan, on behest of Pakistan? Mr. Fai, are you doing it for Pakistan?
And in other international news, after arriving in Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken sought that Israel maintain peace with Palestine. He further urged both the countries to ease tensions following a spike in violence that have left several killed on both the sides.
Hey, good afternoon. You're watching Live and Breaking at 2 p.m. I'm Suesha Savan joining you from the Delhi newsroom. First up in this edition, we begin with the headlines we're tracking at the Sun.
भ्रष्टाचार के विरुद्ध निरंतर लड़ाई चल रही है। हमने 2047 क्या बदला है।
Storm over budget session. Modi government 2.0 set to table last budget ahead of 2024 Lok Sabha polls.
तो इसलिए हमने कल मांग की थी कि सदन में इसके बारे में चर्चा कराई जाए। और कहां छुपी है ईडी, कहां छुपी है सीबीआई, कहां छुपी है इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट, कहां छिपा है सेबी? क्यों नहीं कार्रवाई हो रही है अडानी के ऊपर, जिसने लाखों करोड़ का भ्रष्टाचार किया है? दुनिया का 2 नंबर अमीर था, अभी 11 नंबर पे चला गया। क्यों सरकार खामोश है, क्यों नहीं कार्रवाई कर रही है?
Aam Aadmi Party and BRS MPs skip President Murmu's address, raise Adani versus Hindenburg issue to attack the government.
I rise to lay on the table a copy each of the following papers, Hindi and English version. Economic Survey 2022-23, Economic Survey 2022-23 Highlights, and Economic Survey 22-23 Statistical
संस्करण आपकी अनुमति से सदन के पटल पर
Action. I rise to lay on the table a copy each of the following papers, Hindi and English version. Economic Survey 2022-23, Economic Survey 2022-23 Highlights, and Economic Survey 22-23 Statistical
संस्करण आपकी अनुमति से सदन के पटल पर
Action. I rise to lay on the table a copy each of the following papers, Hindi and English version. Economic Survey 2022-23, Economic Survey 2022-23 Highlights, and Economic Survey
Finance Minister tables Economic Survey 2023 projects 6 to 6.8% growth. IMF gives a thumbs up to India, says global economy to slow down, but growth for India. Andhra Pradesh capital war escalates. Jagan declares Visakhapatnam to be the capital. And we begin this edition with another airline incident that has come to light. This time an Italian woman who was mid-air. Later she was arrested. She brought embarrassment as she was drunk. And these are the breaking details that are just coming in. As the Mumbai police has filed a charge sheet in the case of misbehavior by an airline passenger. It was an Italian woman. Her name was Paola. She was mid-air on a Vistara Abu Dhabi to Mumbai flight. She was arrested by the Sahar police after the landing of the plane yesterday. She was later given bail by the court. And the latest update is a 4-page charge sheet that has been filed in this case. Cutting across to my colleague Alisha, who's with us on the broadcast. Alisha, first up, what are the details about misbehavior from that woman and the 4-page charge sheet that has been filed? Take us through the objective points of the charges that have been pressed against her.
Well, Suesha, the incident is of January 30, where an accused who is an Italian citizen and on board while the flight, a UK flight, that is a Vistara flight UK 256, which boarded from Abu Dhabi to Mumbai. And the time the boarded accused has started demanding for the business class despite having an economic class ticket. When the crew members denied the demand that has been made by the accused, she started punching and also spitting on the crew as well. Not only this, she also took off some of her clothes and starting going towards up and down on the sleeve of the airport on board. And right after that, it was some of the crew members who has handled her. But right after the flight that took off and landed in Mumbai, there was a complaint that was made by the crew members to the police station, and the case has also been registered against her, while the police has also arrested her. But while police produced her before the court, where the court has granted bail to the accused. While we can see even there is a 4-page charge sheet has also been filed by the police, and it was a Sahar police where they were investigating into the case. And even we know that there is a statement that has also been issued by Vistara clearly mentioning that such unruly behavior of a passenger will not be tolerated, and some action has also been taken against some crew who didn't inform about the incident at that point of time. But moreover, police has also taken the cognizance right after the case was registered. The woman was arrested, the accused was arrested, but she was granted bail by the
Dal Khalsa is a group which is actually known for its pro-Khalistani agenda, for pro-Khalistani post, and in fact the hate speeches as well. They post themselves that there are certain people who are trying to engage with them, who are trying to gain the support as well. But now when account has been withheld, this is a clear-cut indication from the side of Indian government that no more hate speeches and no more pro-Khalistani activities would be tolerated either online or offline.
Another stabbing incident reported in Belgium. This video has surfaced from near European Union's headquarters in Brussels. Watch how a man reportedly resorted to a knife attack while on a metro carriage before running through the station. Staff working at the European Union received a security alert warning them to avoid the area around the metro station. Police immediately detained the attacker. Reports suggest that the police had their guns pointed at the man at the station, which is directly under the main office of the European Union's Executive Commission. The station has been closed by police order and the metro services has been interrupted. Further investigation is underway and the motive behind the attack is still to be ascertained. Agency report for Republic TV.
And getting you what had happened this morning as Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had tabled the economic survey ahead of the budget. And as the economic survey projects that India is set to grow, it is the fastest growing economy in the world right now, and it is set to grow at a rate of 7% by the end of March this year. Getting you all those statements.
To lay on the table a copy each of the following papers, Hindi and English version: Economic Survey 2022-23, Economic Survey 2022-23 Highlights, and Economic Survey 22-23 Statistical Appendix. I rise to lay on the table a copy each of the following papers, Hindi and English version: Economic Survey 2022-23, Economic Survey 2022-23 Highlights, and Economic Survey 22-23 Statistical Appendix.
All right, so getting you the highlights of the Economic Survey 2023 as Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the Economic Survey ahead of the Union Budget. The survey forecasted India's economic growth at 6 to 6.8% for the next fiscal year starting April 1st, lower than 7% as projected for the current year due to the expected impact of the global slowdown on exports. Now, despite this, India's growth is still expected to be the fastest among major economies. The Economic Survey is mainly putting out details of how India's economy is set to grow at 6.5% in 2023-24 compared to 7% this fiscal and 8.7% in 2021-22. Hence, it projects that India remains the fastest growing major economy in the world. And on to other stories that are also making headlines. Addressing the media ahead of the budget session of Parliament, Prime Minister Modi said amid global economic turmoil, India's budget will attempt to meet the hopes and aspirations of common citizens and be a ray of hope for the world.
भारतीय जनता पार्टी के नेतृत्व में एनडीए सरकार, उसका एक ही मकसद रहा है, एक ही मोटो रहा है, एक ही लक्ष्य रहा है और हमारी कार्य संस्कृति के केंद्र बिंदु में भी
To begin with, the Chief Economic Advisor will make a presentation on the major details of economic survey. Thereafter, there will be question answer from you all. So, over to. Yeah, we can. Sure. Just have to zoom.
All right, so as is being looked as the Amrit Kal, exactly what was spoken, details of the Economic Survey 2023-24. Remember, we just got out of the news conference by the Chief Economic Advisor and hoping to hear from him in a short while from now.
1 more months to go, so I wish you all a very happy and healthy rest of 2023. This morning, we had the International Monetary Fund release its World Economic Outlook update. And they maintained India's GDP forecast or estimate for current financial year at 6.8, next financial year at 6.1, and importantly, for 24-25, they kept India's real GDP growth forecast at 6.8%. So they show an acceleration of India's GDP after a slight dip which they estimate for the next financial year. In fact, the presentation today is going to focus on this aspect, that India's GDP growth is poised to do better in the remainder of this decade, and that is the focus of this economic survey itself. Okay. What moving? Mm-hmm. देखिए सर.
All right, there may be a slight pause in that news briefing, and we are expecting it to resume shortly from now. Those are the important statements coming in from the Chief Economic Advisor as we once again keep our focus on the highlights of the Economic Survey 2022-23. Remember, as the survey is forecasting India's economic growth at 6 to 6.8% for the next fiscal year starting April 1st. Also with me on the phone line is our Senior Executive Editor Abhishek Kapoor. Abhishek, there may be some technical glitch because of which that news briefing has just paused for the moment. But as we keep our focus on...
Why is the economic growth going to perform better this decade, remainder of the decade? And what the reforms of the last 8 years have done to make sure that happens? And beyond 2030, what will be India's medium-term growth magnets? And finally, as we look ahead to 2047, what else and what more we could do to realize India's full potential in the Amrit Kal? And if you look at the... Is it moving properly on the screens? Okay, thank you. The survey looks ahead to the medium term because the pandemic response and recovery phase is over. In fact, Chapter 1, the title itself says, State of the Economy, Recovery Complete. And therefore, after a long time, we have banking, non-banking and corporate sectors with healthy balance sheets, and they are ready to borrow and lend and invest. So we don't have to speak about, and they are ready to borrow and lend and invest. So we don't have to speak about pandemic recovery anymore. We have to look ahead to the next phase of India's economic growth process. So why is economic growth going to be better this decade? In order to look ahead to the future, we always have to first look back at the rearview mirror. Let's rewind the tape a little bit. What happened in the first decade of the millennium was a lot of optimism about BRICS economies. By 2002, balance sheets were lean and mean. Companies were willing to borrow, invest, banks were willing to lend. So leverage ratio in the corporate sector and in the overall non-financial private sector rose very sharply in the first decade. And it got to the point where the credit to GDP ratio in actual terms was much higher than the trend in the first decade of the millennium. That is what you see. The middle hump is basically actual credit GDP ratio was well above trend, and it persisted for a long time. And because it was quite well above trend and also lasted longer, naturally it led to a period of excess borrowing and excess lending. And the second decade was a payback time. So India went through a classic financial cycle, credit boom and credit bust, and this is not something new for the world. Every time you go through a financial boom and bust, it does leave its impact on economic growth, and that is what happened to us, especially in the second half of last decade. And you can see this here. Look at this chart. From 1980 to 2000, the bank credit to GDP ratio was roughly around between 25 and 30%, and then it jumped from 25 to 55, 60%, and spent the second decade of this millennium hovering in that range. This is the digestion process. So there was massive expansion. Remember, this is a ratio. GDP went up, but the bank credit expanded even more than GDP growth, and naturally such a big spike within a space of 10 years, what we could not achieve in the previous 20 years, naturally had to lead to some kind of a credit indigestion problem, which had to be adjusted in the second decade. And now that process of indigestion that has been sorted out, and the balance sheets are repaired now, and banks' non-performing ratio, whether it is scheduled commercial banks in general or public sector banks, they are lower now. And you can see that also banks have done so partly through recapitalization, raising fresh equity, and also through higher provisioning. So bank balance sheets are repaired, and that is why you see that in the credit growth picking up. You look at credit growth across sectors, agriculture, industry, services and personal sector, housing loans and car loans, etc. The growth rate is now sustainably above double digits. And this is a sign that this is what we were missing towards the second half of last decade because of balance sheet issues. So to quickly summarize exactly what happened was 2005 to 12 credit boom that led to balance sheet stress later, phase of a higher non-performing assets due to past forbearance, and then by the time we could repair, just want to leave one statistic with you. The non-financial private sector leverage ratio, debt to GDP, went up by 40 percentage points in the first decade, from 2000 to 2010. And from 2010 to 2018, it came down by 30 percentage points. And by 2018, that was kind of done, it had bottomed out, but before we could start expecting corporates to borrow and banks to lend, came the collapse of IL&FS and some housing finance companies. And by the time we got a grip on that problem, came the pandemic. That lasted 2 years. And then 2022, we had the commodity price shock and synchronized monetary policy tightening after a very long time in the developed world. So it's a case of balance sheet stress followed by successive one-off exogenous or external shocks that have basically prevented the impact of economic reforms pursued by the government on economic growth. We would have seen the results already, but for these successive one-off shocks on the back of a fairly large credit boom that turned into a bust. The reforms of the last 8 years, which I just now mentioned to you, basically spans multiple dimensions. It is not purely about economic reforms for higher growth. It is also about inclusive growth, financial inclusion, banking cleanup, the creation of the digital public infrastructure, which I think I'm going to talk about a bit later as well, and contribution to healthy India, ease of living, and continuing on to the next slide, physical infrastructure creation, facilitating investments, transparent taxes and tax administration, ease of doing business, and farmers' welfare. So broadly speaking, about 10 areas we have covered here. These reforms were happening even as the banking cleanup was going on. And this episode between 2014 and 2022 has a lot of parallel to what happened between 98 and 2002 as well. Then, as now, the banking system was coming out of an NPA crisis, and there were sanctions on India after the nuclear device was tested in Pokhran in 98, and deleveraging was getting on in the banking and corporate sector. There were 2 successive droughts. The technology boom ended, internet boom ended in 1999-2000, and the US recession followed, 9/11 happened. But amidst all these shocks, interest rates were deregulated, privatization was pursued vigorously, and the first foundations of the insolvency and bankruptcy regime was laid with the asset recovery mechanisms. The FRBM Act was introduced, and today's digital infrastructure which we talk about, the foundation for that was laid with telecom reforms in that era. But obviously, there is a lagged effect for these reforms to show through in the data because underlying conditions had to turn favorable. We talk of public digital infrastructure. Okay. I think it's not enough if I just look at the screen, right? Yes. I'm reminded of what economist Joan Robinson said in the 1960s about India. Whatever you say about India, the opposite is equally true. That's what she said. And so anyway, the parallels to the 1998-2002 period, to this period is that even as a crisis was being addressed, economic reforms were pursued, and when underlying conditions turned favorable, the lagged effect of reforms showed through. That's exactly what is reflected, for example, in the IMF forecast, and that is what we expect in the medium term as well. The lagged effect of the reforms will show through because in the last several years, the full effect of the reforms could not be felt in the data because of successive one-off shocks. And that's why we talk about the medium-term growth magnets for the economy. The entire philosophy of economic management revolves around making it easier for people to pursue their economic activities in individual lives or for businesses, and ultimately leading to efficient resource allocation and, more importantly, enhancing the potential of the economy to grow at a higher rate. And that includes, obviously, it is an indicative list and not a complete list, agricultural growth, a trust-based governance model, public goods for inclusive growth, both infrastructure, digital and physical, and many other things which will come under that, involving the private sector, and more importantly, managing the energy transition, reducing our dependence, and also addressing climate change issues as well. It is not about the government doing things for the people, but also involving people in the process. Everybody is a participant in the development process. That is why it is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So it is not just a government being an enabler, but government being a partner to economic growth. First, we deal with one of the pillars, agricultural growth. Thanks to many of the initiatives which you see around this slide, what you see is that the share of private sector investment or capital formation in agriculture has reached a level which is higher in the last 12 years. Since 2013-14, 9.3% of overall gross capital formation is contributed by the private sector in agricultural sector. And it has been facilitated by the creation of the Agricultural Infrastructure Fund, a national agriculture market which has linked farmers with direct buyers, FPOs which take into account organic farming options as well, and more importantly for the farmer, income support as well as risk management through crop insurance. All of these things have paved the way for greater participation of the private sector in capital formation in the agricultural sector. This sector is no longer about being a primary sector. It also has tremendous export potential, as we have been observing lately in our merchandise goods data for the last several years. What about the trust-based governance model, the second pillar of the development and growth strategy? The Insolvency Bankruptcy Code restores trust between the borrower and the lender. The borrower has an exit option and so does the lender. And that is the key to this. And the important thing is, more than 7 lakh cases, even before they come into the IBC process, have actually gotten resolved before they enter the process. And that is the most important thing, which doesn't get captured in the data. The usefulness of IBC is in ensuring borrower payment culture even before they enter into a resolution process. Ease of doing business, one illustrative example is the Real Estate Development Regulation Act, which has ensured trust between developers and buyers, making them more transparent and check-based transactions rather than relying on black money. Effective governance is about making sure that the public don't feel threatened by legislations and rules and regulations, and every time they commit a mistake innocuously, it need not be deemed a criminal offense. So decriminalization of many provisions of Companies Act and several other economic offenses restores trust between the governing and the governed as well. And in terms of the trust with respect to public accounts and public money, there are many dimensions. It is not just about the quality of expenditure that has gone up in recent years. Of course, capital expenditure in government budget has gone up from 12% to 19% in the last 5 years, and revenue expenditure share has gone down. However, it is not just about the quality of expenditure improvement. The way the government has become more transparent with respect to the budget deficit numbers, the prudential assumptions being made for budget deficit calculations, etc., expenditure management, making sure that public procurement is transparent and enables everyone to compete and have a fair shot at becoming a supplier to the government. All these things are part of fiscal and public expenditure management. Now, moving on to the more macro dimension of it, if you look at the last 16 years, there is much talk about today of India's high deficit debt to GDP ratio. You can see that among the countries that saw very little increase in the public debt to GDP ratio, India is one of them. India, Germany, and Indonesia in the last 16 years. In fact, you will see in the survey in Chapter 3, we have done an exercise, a counterfactual exercise. In 2019-20, 2021 and 21-22, instead of the actual nominal GDP growth rates which we experienced, if only the economy had continued to grow at a rate of 10% nominal terms, the fiscal deficit and debt ratios would be a lot lower than where they are today. The point is, because of India's growth dynamics and the cost of capital being lower than the nominal GDP growth, there is enough scope for the fiscal parameters to improve in the coming years once we achieve sustained and steady growth as we expect. And that you will see in Chapter 3 on the fiscal side. Creating public goods for inclusive growth, that is the third pillar. And it is not only about physical infrastructure, although it is an important part of it, in terms of the amount of kilometers of highways completed, electricity installed capacity. This is RBI showing that in 2011, if you put them as an index value of 100, where they stand today in 2020, excepting the case of railway track, which because much of it was laid already, and therefore even a 14% improvement in 9 years in terms of 8,000 kilometers added is a very big number. But in every other case, national highways or cargo handling capacity, the growth rate is 80% or doubled in the last 10 years or so. And on the softer policy side, apart from physical milestones, you have public-private partnerships, the national infrastructure pipeline, the national monetization pipeline, which will improve economic efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, and the PM Gati Shakti, which is still in its early years. The underlying purpose of it is to make sure that public investment projects get completed without cost and time overruns, and there is synergy between various departments such a way that sequencing happens naturally and logically, and therefore delays are minimized. So PM Gati Shakti is about reducing information asymmetries and making sure that government projects are executed on time and within cost estimates. The national logistics policy is an important cog in the wheel. Our export competitiveness is hampered by the fact that logistics costs constitute 14 to 15%. The goal is to halve it and bring it down to international levels, and this national logistics policy will play a very important part in that. The public digital infrastructure, about which now there is a lot of justified optimism on India, not only in the country but outside as well. The initial phase of reforms started with the identity and then the Jan Dhan Yojana, financial inclusion, Aadhaar and mobile. And then it moved on to unified payment interface, which allows even payment as small as 2 rupees through a barcode. Common service centers for IT-enabled services. PM Disha, digital DigiLocker, BharatNet and services at a click. Now, they have set the stage for new age reforms, which is now going to make sure that hitherto neglected segments of society, low-income households and micro businesses, get a fair shot at accessing national and international markets and getting funded by financial institutions. These digital developments allow all of them to leave their digital footprint, which creates a credit history for them, so that they are able to access finance as well as access markets. And that is the potential of digital infrastructure. Even though it's almost 5-6 years old since the beginning, formal study of how much digital infrastructure contributes to growth is yet to be undertaken. But it is my belief that India's improved balance sheets and the digital infrastructure together will add anywhere between 60 to 100 basis points to India's potential GDP growth, which is what we were missing in the course of the second decade. This is an elevation and enhancement in India's potential GDP growth, because the baseline is assumed to be around 6% by many international organizations. But what is important is we have a financial cycle that was disrupted in the second decade. That is coming back. And we have the new development, public digital infrastructure, that is adding another 30 to 50 basis points. So together, these two developments add about 50 to 100 basis points to the trend growth which many organizations peg for India at 6%. And that is why my optimism is that in the coming decade, rest of the decade, the potential GDP growth, without taking into account export potential, because the global economy is still rife with uncertainty, the growth rate could be around 6.5% to 7% rather than between 6 and 6.5%. Ultimately, economic growth is only a means to an end. And what is that end? The end is prosperous and dignified living for citizens. And therefore, basically, the chapter on the social sector, in a departure from the previous economic surveys, we have actually brought it to the front of the economic survey. After the initial state of the economy, medium-term outlook, fiscal and monetary affairs, inflation, the sixth chapter in the survey is on social sector, and perhaps it is the longest and the biggest chapter in the entire economic survey this year. And there is a reason for it, both in terms of its placement and its size, because the interventions made by the government have been substantial, and it is to make sure that no one is left behind. This is about inclusive growth. And as you can see here, and the survey, not only the full document, but the highlights also capture the elements of this with outcomes as well, ranging from electricity, healthcare, food security, affordable housing, drinking water and sanitation, all the way to cooking fuel, all-weather roads and skill development. Outlays have become outcomes, and they are covered in detail in the social chapter. More specifically, in terms of outcomes, you can see here, general government spending, both union and state governments put together. Education spending has gone up from 5.3 lakh crores to 7.6 lakh crores, and health almost more than doubled in the last 3 years, And other than health and education, we have gone up from 4.86 lakh crores to 8.3 lakh crores approximately. The outcomes are seen on the right side. Primary school dropout rate has come down from around 4.7% down to 1.5%. The pupil-to-teacher ratio has improved from 34 to 26, and there are going to be 14,500 PM Shri schools to be established in the next 4-5 years. And while we are seeing the pupil-to-teacher ratio,
Viewers are getting some update coming in, a breaking update coming in. BBC lands in massive controversy. Mahesh Jethmalani has now tweeted, and I quote here, "Why is BBC so anti-India? Because it needs money desperately, enough to take it from Chinese state-linked Huawei and pursue the latest agenda. And also, it's a simple cash for propaganda deal. BBC is up for sale." Going ahead to our executive editor, Niranjan, for more detail. Niranjan, it's a claim by Mahesh Jethmalani. Just take our viewers through that.
Well, this is a very, very big claim, in fact, and Mahesh Jethmalani, he's also on the phone line, but I just want to tell you what Mahesh Jethmalani has done. Mahesh Jethmalani, the UK media, and this is huge, and you've been talking about it. The UK Spectator has said, why is BBC so anti-India? Because it needs money desperately enough to take it from Chinese state-linked Huawei. Mahesh Jethmalani is joining us on the phone line right now. Let me go across to him. Mahesh Jethmalani, this article is scathing. Essentially, it says that Huawei is a paid partner of the BBC. Huawei is funding the BBC. They have a special relationship with the BBC. Does that explain what the BBC is doing with India? Mahesh Jethmalani.
Yes, not just that. Huawei has been sanctioned by the UK government. It has been banned from UK 5G trials. In spite of that, BBC has been taking money. Now, I'll tell you something, that they've done this very cleverly, right? They don't take it for BBC UK, right? But they take it from an overseas organization, so that while the UK doesn't get propaganda material funded by China, it's overseas, wherever it's broadcast overseas, we poor ex-colonials, right, are getting BBC, Huawei or Chinese state financed BBC propaganda.
This is huge. It explains what the BBC has been trying to do. And in fact, this report, which has been published by UK Spectator, Mahesh Jethmalani also talks about how some people, or at least whoever's left of these kind of people who are disgusted with such propaganda that the BBC is doing, internally there seems to be a huge rebellion in the BBC as well on what they're trying to do.
There is internal disgruntlement in the BBC itself. One of the criticisms of BBC, right, within the organization, is that while it proclaims and champions rights for the Uyghurs in China, the Chinese Uyghurs, right, at the same time, it is taking money from the very oppressors of those Uyghurs.
Well, and some more, and it appears it's specifically and categorically for content outside the UK, so it's very smart. It's very smart.
That's right. It is Niranjan, it is sneaky, it is clandestine, and it is hypocritical.
And Mahesh Jethmalani does this. I don't know, you've been tweeting about Jairam Ramesh, you've been asking questions to the Congress party, but and you've been asking questions about Jairam Ramesh and Huawei. I'll repeat that. It's the axis that is making sense right now, or it's just an allegations putting dots together, joining the dots. Congress / Jairam Ramesh / Huawei / the BBC. Is it possible? Can it be ruled out? What's going on with all these three put together with India?
The combination of circumstances is not mere coincidence. All that is happening now, the attack on Prime Minister Modi, right, and the raising of questions during the Bharat Jodo Yatra by Jairam Ramesh, himself a great empathizer, to say the least, of Huawei, right, is
extremely now suspicious and leads to an almost irresistible inference that this whole hit job has been coordinated and planned by a number of actors.
It's, if anything, it just raises more questions. It raises more questions on the credibility of the BBC. I mean, we didn't have a doubt about that. Mahesh Jethmalani, do you plan to raise this in Parliament? You're a parliamentarian. The Parliament session is on. The opposition has been armed. They made it clear they're going to raise the BBC documentary. One among many issues. Will you be raising this point?
Well, I hope the BJP Parliamentary Party permits me to do it, and the BJP Parliamentary Party itself points out the motives of those who are fanning this BBC documentary.
It's an explosive revelation, one that the media didn't know about. Mahesh Jethmalani, thank you very much for bringing it to light. In fact, we've learned it from your tweet, not that we closely monitor the UK media. We'll speak to you more. This is going to be one of the big stories. Mahesh Jethmalani, they're joining us. He put out that tweet, Shravan, sometime back. But this very detailed article in The Spectator, I'm just opening up this article here, Shravan. Essentially what this article says, Shravan, is that the BBC outside, and this is a Spectator article, this is the UK media which has put out this article saying BBC is still taking money from sanctioned Huawei. So here's the situation. Here's the situation, Shravan. UK may have banned Huawei, but the BBC, which is sponsored by the government money in UK, is continuing to work with Huawei through funding for special, what we call branded content, Shravan. Let me go across, show you the pictures of the protest. My colleague Shravan is joining us live. Shravan, it's like this. I mean, just to simplify it or try and put it in context, Shravan. It's like if the DD, if India had banned Huawei, and the Doordarshan is India's public broadcaster, and the DD were to take funding from Huawei, which is banned by India, it's like that. And they're calling it special partnership for world-class journalism at a time when Chinese firms, Chinese groups have been trying to target India. This is what comes out, and I think it raises many questions. Shravan, some questions on your mind when you look at this.
Well, in fact, it's important to highlight the fact that Huawei, which has been banned by not just the United Kingdom, but several countries put together. The reason essentially being that they are suspected of carrying out snooping. The fact that there is also concerns about data privacy, and the fact of the matter is that there was larger concerns about whether at all this data that was being collected by Huawei was that being sold in the open market. So there are larger security concerns, and that is the reason why several countries have taken this decision of not allowing Huawei to continue with their operations. One such country happens to be United Kingdom, and as you rightly pointed out, a state broadcaster openly taking sponsorship from a very company which is dubious when it comes to its own operations. The United States, if you look at multiple reports that have been submitted by the CIA, or for that matter several other investigative agencies, security concerns have been massive, and their operations, remember, have been curtailed to a larger extent primarily because of this very reason. Whether at all China was basically benefiting from the operations that have been carried out by Huawei, and that is the reason why if you really look at these concerns coming up, this was also being linked to political parties in China, the Communist Party itself, and the way they were basically benefiting from the operations of Huawei, and the fact that it has a larger security ramification. All that put together, if you really look at it, then of course questions would be asked as to whether at all the BBC has essentially done a background check, and can they really get away by simply saying that these are sponsored content? Because if you go beyond in the article that has already been published, the fact of the matter is that the BBC hasn't really come clean on this entire matter. Let's not forget that even if there were security checks that were basically done, a background check that was also done, can they really justify the fact that their own government, from which the substantial amount of funding essentially comes from, they have put a ban on this very company and its operations. United States has also been very skeptical as far as Huawei's operations are concerned. So there too, if you see, there has been a curtailment. Despite that, when you have a broadcaster like the BBC taking funds from a company like this, questions would certainly come up. Remains to be seen whether at all there is going to be any sort of response coming in from the BBC, which is always, perhaps taken a high moral ground on most issues.
And Shravan, there have been protests. Even today there were protests outside the BBC's headquarters in London. There are no answers coming from the BBC on this docu-series, but it appears prima facie, the documentary that has been timed almost to the budget session, to whatever is happening. Many BJP leaders have been raising questions. The government has banned and questioned the intent. There are intelligence agencies that have asked questions about this docu-series. Prima facie, what are some of the questions that emerge on the motive of the BBC as far as the docu-series go, Shravan?
Well, in fact, if you see, there hasn't been any response from the BBC when it comes to their own docu-series, which they say that it's a product of years of investigation. Now, large part of what they have put out in public domain right now is something that was known to everyone. More importantly, the courts have basically cleared it. And we are talking about the apex court of this country clearing this entire matter. But if you really look at the spin that has been given in the docu-series, that in itself raises several questions about the intention. Were there malafide intentions on the part of a broadcaster like that of the BBC? And with regards to the timings, there is over a period of time, if you really look at it, there appears to be a pattern. The pattern essentially being that even if you remember when multiple riots were taking place in the country, especially in the national capital too, it was basically timed with the fact that there was a visit by the US president at that point in time. And later on, when the investigation was actually carried out by the police here in the national capital, it turned out that there was a conspiracy behind it. Now, if you look at the same situation right now, in terms of the fact when, if the global growth, there is a prediction of a slowdown as far as global growth is concerned, the prospects of India growing has been far more. And it does appear that India is now coming across as a threat to especially countries like the United Kingdom, which is slipping on various fronts. But having said that, what the BBC and their masters have essentially been doing is the fact that try to discredit this entire economic growth that the country faces, and putting the spotlight on issues which have already been settled by none other than the Supreme Court of this particular country. That does not find a single mention. And if you really look at some of the representations that have been made by the BBC on various stories, it does appear that there is a malicious intent to try and misrepresent on various issues. For instance, when it comes to their reportage of Kashmir too, look at the map that has essentially been used by the BBC. Despite the international claims that have been made by India, BBC seems to have been going ahead, and somewhere pandering to the hopes and the needs of countries like Pakistan, for that matter, even being subservient to China, for that matter. Having said that, what's important to point out here is that there is a pattern, and that pattern is now essentially being highlighted by the ruling party in this country.
There are some very, very shocking charges and details from this article, Shravan. It appears Shivangi is also joining us on the broadcast. Shivangi, one current employee, and I'm reading from this article, a current employee speaking on the condition of anonymity. This is an employee of the BBC, told the author of this article of Spectator, it is the UK media. Now, the beauty of it is the UK media has exposed BBC. The UK media has exposed BBC, and this author was told, the person who wrote the article was told by a current employee of the BBC that they were shocked that the BBC was still taking money from a company with such close ties to the Chinese state, when it was us, the BBC, which exposed the Chinese abuse in Uyghur camps last year. It was the Chinese, so on one hand, the BBC is banned, exposes Uyghur, it claims. The UK bans Huawei. The UK's public broadcaster is showing, public broadcasters taking money, Shavan. And it can't be more brazen than this. And it appears that this is, hypocrisy of the worst kind, the kind that BBC often preaches about. What are the charges against Huawei? Let's talk about Huawei, Shavan. For a second, let's talk about Huawei. Huawei is a company, if I'm not wrong, was it not founded by a member of the PLA? Its close links to the Chinese government is known, right, Shavan?
Well, in fact, there was a massive expose on Huawei and the links that emerged with top political leaders in China. The charge that was basically leveled against this particular company was of, collecting data in a surreptitious manner. And this data was eventually being utilized to, draft several of their policies and their policy towards that very country from where the data has essentially been taken. And more importantly, there were security ramifications, clear security ramifications of spying, carrying out spying activities through this very company. And remember, China essentially faces that charge not through this particular company, but there is a larger modus operandi. The modus operandi of the Chinese essentially being that most of these companies who have dubious links have been under the scanner even in our country. Let's not forget Xiaomi being one of the companies where their entire operations have been restricted, given the fact that it turns out that the dealings that were being done by companies, the Chinese-backed companies, were with a clear intention of trying to disrupt the law and order situation in this particular in the country. Now, coming back to the issue of Huawei, the fact of the matter is that there have been security ramifications, especially their operations closer to the border areas, or for that matter, in countries where there have been disputed issues, which they have manipulated in multiple ways. And that is the reason why not one, but a dozen countries now coming together and curtailing the operations of Huawei, and they have also knocked at the doors of various courts abroad, but there hasn't been any sort of major relief for this company.
Well, this is a big scandal, Shavan, and the scandal is so huge. The BBC will now have to make a disclosure on the motivation behind carrying out this hit job on India, this propaganda piece. And even the parties in India which now want to raise this issue in Parliament will have to ask themselves whether they stand with a company that is taking Chinese money or not. Shavan, I think we need to take a short break. Stay with me, Shavan. We'll take a break and we'll come back on this breaking story. The story is big. The UK media has exposed the BBC. China pays BBC. Chinese PLA veteran founded Huawei. It's backed by the government of China. And Huawei is one of the main sponsors of the BBC's content outside of UK. What an irony. UK bans Huawei, but BBC takes money from Huawei. Hypocrisy of the biggest kind. Global hypocrisy there on display. Let's take a short break. Back with the story. Stay tuned.
Top global updates. Denmark's Prime Minister visited Ukraine and met President Zelensky, while Ukrainian President thanked Denmark for its steadfast support since the beginning of the Russian invasion. However, reiterated his stance that weapons deliveries must be expedited. President Emmanuel Macron said Ukraine has not yet put in a formal request for fighter jets before France. Earlier, France had sent Ukraine air defense systems rocket launcher units, but has stopped short of sending battle tanks. United Nations confirmed that fighting and hostilities over the weekend in Ukraine killed and injured civilians, while critical facilities, including several hospitals, were damaged on both sides of the front line.
Accident which has taken place on the Sarjapur road. It was an intentional accident which was caused by the bikers as well, because if you look at Ventat footage which was recorded on the dash camera, it is clearly being seen that this particular couple who were traveling on the Sarjapur road towards Chiknayak-Nalli were in the right lane, but then these two bikers who have already been identified as Dhanush and Rakshit come in from the wrong direction and crash into the vehicle intentionally on purpose, trying to extort money.
Mr. Fai, you are doing this for Pakistan. Mr. Fai, are you doing it on behalf of Pakistan, on behest of Pakistan? Mr. Fai, are you doing it for Pakistan?
And in other international news, after arriving in Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken sought that Israel maintain peace with Palestine. He further urged both the countries to ease tensions following a spike in violence that have left several killed on both the sides. Some 200 people had to be evacuated from a migrant camp near Spain's farming heartland after fire crews battled flames that engulfed the buildings. Meanwhile, it was unclear how the fire started. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen visited Ukraine and met with President Volodymyr Zelensky, while the Ukrainian president thanked Denmark for its steadfast support of Ukraine since the beginning of the Russian invasion. To visit the nation's Armed Forces Operations Command denied to comment on an ongoing debate over a possible delivery of fighter jets to Ukraine. Finland has once more expressed its wish to join NATO alongside Sweden. Speaking at a press conference in Helsinki, Foreign Minister of Finland said it was important that Finland and Sweden join NATO at the same time. Russia has refuted claims made by UK former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, while saying that he had lied in a recently released documentary where he had described a phone call with Vladimir Putin.
You are doing this for Pakistan. Mr. Fai, are you doing it on behalf of Pakistan, on behest of Pakistan? Mr. Fai, are you doing it for Pakistan?
Viewers, we're breaking in the big story right now is that BBC is landing in a massive controversy, viewers. A UK spectator's big claim has come, exposing a huge propaganda that the BBC, I repeat, the BBC using funds of Huawei for overseas operations. And this is what we're learning so far. Remember that the BJP MP and senior advocate Mahesh Jethmalani has attacked the BBC, accused it of receiving funds from Chinese state-linked Huawei outside the United Kingdom, quoting UK magazine The Spectator. Let's go ahead, viewers, and play out that conversation that we had, Republic TV had with Mahesh Jethmalani.
Huawei has been sanctioned by the UK government. It has been banned from UK 5G trials. In spite of that, BBC has been taking money. Now, I'll tell you something, that they've done this very cleverly, right? They don't take it for BBC UK, right? But they take it from an overseas organization, so that while the UK doesn't get propaganda material funded by China, it's overseas, wherever it's broadcast overseas, we poor ex-colonials, right, are getting Huawei or Chinese state-financed BBC propaganda.
This is huge. It explains what the BBC has been trying to do. And in fact,